No.
I'll sit behind guys.
So there's a flick switch on the back to turn on power into the unit. It does have an internal battery that will last anywhere between an hour and 2 hours, depending on the settings and how fast the patient's breathing. It actually hasn't been plugged in for some time, so it's just alarming low internal batteries. I'm going to plug it in. It just means it's depleted while it's been sitting in storage. Hopefully it just works for us. There we go. So it's plugged in now, it's happy. It just sits in standby, it's got the time on the front there. What we tend to teach staff is follow the guide to set it up. So as I said, we do have a setup guide. So I guess I'll set it up the way we tend to on the ward. Or do you want me just to leave the humidifier bit out and I'll just use the long piece?
Yeah, just use the humidifier out, yeah.
There's a little bacterial viral filter that comes in the pack. So that goes on first. The setup guide has a good big diagram on it to show people exactly what bits go where, because it can be some time in between using these devices. Even for the ward staff upstairs, it might be a month or so between using it, so a good setup guide is pretty handy. Circuit followed by a mask setup. So we use a non-vented mask. You guys do here as well, don't you? Non-vented mask?
Yeah, just to make it comfortable.
So there's a separate vent that goes into the circuit after a bacterial viral filter. So in COVID times, you might have felt through filtering with expiratory breath from the patient. So there's a little diagram to tell you which way the patient should be. So the patient should be at this end, that filter, and then I know this mask will look a bit different to yours, but these are great masks. They might be twice the price of your mask. Last time I looked, they were $50, and I think you were using $25 masks, but they're really comfortable, really, the patients really tolerate them well. There's very little leak, and there's never any pressure injuries from them. So on the top of every mask, there's a rip-off template to measure the face, but we only stock smalls, mediums, and larges. But you can see from that, there's the patient, they breathe out through the viral filter, and it gets the cements on the top here. It's also an anti-asphyxia valve, so if for some reason it turns off, there's a little flapper valve that will open and they'll be able to breathe. So that's reassuring to know.
Can I ask a question? When we give ventilators or after we can put these have a little attachment, does that go with it?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, you can still fit that in here. Obviously you want to have it before the filter, so you're not filtering it, but yeah, it'll fit in there.
Yeah, the ideal thing, yeah.
In the eye connector. There's an oxygen nipple on the back, so you'll notice it's a bit different to your regular ventilators that plug straight into, high flow oxygen. So this maximum flow of oxygen is 15 litres that can go into this machine. And that's one thing you'll notice. It won't actually give you an FiO2 on the machine. So you guys are probably used to recording 30-35%. This would just be 2, 3 litres, 4 litres, 8 litres, whatever it might be. So that'll be a bit of a change for you. But there is just a selection on the screen there that you can toggle between with the knob. Learn circuit, and then you would press the knob, and it would just run through its cycle. Once the learn circuit's done, you can then put in your settings. So there's 3 buttons on the far right. There's lungs at the top, and that tends to relate to what the patient's doing. So if you want their observations, that'll bring up the screen with the observations on it. 2 ticks in the middle is always about settings. So your ventilator settings and your alarm settings are in there. There's a couple of different pages. You press it twice, and then the information gives you a log of a summary of any of the alarms. You can also get some graphs on here, but they're tiny graphs, and you probably wouldn't find them particularly useful compared to what you're used to. So I'm going to press the middle button to put in our settings. So the terminology might be a bit different to what you're used to as well. Within if I toggle to mode, there's a few different options. If I press on it, we've got CPAP. There's spontaneous and spontaneous timed, Upstairs we tend to just use spontaneous timed, which is bi-level ventilation. Some people call it BiPAP, but that's Respironics BiPAP. Bi-level's a more generic sort of term for bi-level ventilation. So we would only ever use ST. It then gives you the option of setting an IPAP, inspiratory positive airway pressure, and an expiratory positive airway pressure. Is that terminology you're used to, or do you use? Yep, good. So this will all be on the order form, presumably. There's a backup respiratory rate as well, and then the last tile is advanced settings. So some of these more advanced settings might be a bit different to what you're used to as well. There's, I think on your V60, did you just set a fixed inspiratory time?
We can do a RAM. Oh, that's low delivery though.
Yeah, that's probably what we call the rise.
You
on
can
here.
change the time. Yeah.
Okay, because there's a window for our inspiratory time. Ah, thanks, Len. There's a good chart on
Put a
that.
cheat sheet on the back of the order form to try to give some sort of a range of settings that we tend to use up on the ward. And because these settings, particularly the ones Gav's talking about, so the inspiratory time, you can set a range of a maximum and a minimum inspiratory time. And then rise time is probably the other one that we adjust. We don't tend to do a lot with the fall time. That's when it drops from IPAP to EPAP, we just leave that as fixed. But then we also have given some advice about the trigger, which is how sensitive, how much effort the patient needs to make before the device delivers a breath, and then the cycle, which is basically how insensitive the device is before it drops back to its expiratory pressure. So we've tried to do it according to the pathology, and most of the patients who'll be getting it will either be COPD or obesity. So they'd be the ones I'd be sort of paying the most attention to. There's some stuff for neuromuscular in there, which occasionally you might be treating acutely, but these would be the two biggest groups. And they're just suggestions, because it's very hard for us to give you here's what you should set every time. But obviously, if this is an unfamiliar device, sort of using that as a bit of am I sort of roughly where I think this patient should be, we think that's probably a reasonable start point.
So that's it on now. It brings up a little green bar on the left-hand side, and there's a white line alternating between inspiratory pressure and expiratory pressure. There's some tiny little numbers down there, but you can get those. They're what you're going to be recording as the patient's observations, but you can make bigger tiles by pressing the lungs. So it'll tell you what the patient's doing. Their actual leak, their tidal volume, their respiratory rate, minute ventilation, IE ratio, and so on is there. Good. So similar thing. The button goes. You press the button on to blow, and I can pretend I'm a patient and show you what the. Just
from a safety perspective, just the ones that we used to have, you could have it on standby mode, and the minute you put it over the patient's face, if they had a breath, it would trigger it. Is that the same with these, or you have to actually press the button to turn it on?
So we should be able to set Smart Start on this, I think. Let me just have a look. Yeah, Smart Start. So there is a facility to do that. We don't tend to use it upstairs, but I can turn that on. And yeah, as soon as you put the mask on, the patient takes a breath, it will turn on. Same as if he takes it off, it'll just stop blowing as well. So if you want that, that can be turned on. Set a leak limit. It's just on or off, but that's where it will alarm once it's above 40 litres per minute. There's the usual high pressure, low pressure, high respiratory rate, low respiratory rate. So you guys would be familiar with setting those, I imagine. So I don't need to go into those too much. Now, the alarm volume, you can actually set how loud you want it to be. So you guys probably want it on high because it's so loud in here.